Oni są zupełnie są z nim metiuczy.
A brilliant diplomat finds himself unemployed overnight when his government falls. Desperate to regain relevance, he writes a short handbook on political power as a job application. 5 centuries later, that handbook has shaped the minds of revolutionaries and tyrants, presidents and prime ministers, business leaders and military strategists. The author died believing himself a failure, never knowing he had created the most influential work of political analysis ever written. Niccolò Machiavelli did not intend to become the most misunderstood and controversial
Amerykański
political
account.
thinker in history.
Dodradim Jade przeleciałem
He simply
na niemu.
refused to accept the comfortable lies that political theory had been telling for over 1,000 years. Where others saw moral instruction and philosophical idealism, he saw practical problems requiring practical solutions. Where others preached about how the world should work, he observed relentlessly how it actually does work. This shift from normative theory to empirical analysis fundamentally transformed political thought and created the foundation for modern political science. But it also made him the most feared name in political philosophy, a man whose insights were too dangerous to ignore and too uncomfortable to embrace. Part 1. The Effectual Truth Revolution. The entire edifice of Machiavellian political philosophy rests on a single devastating methodological innovation. Previous political theorists had focused on what Machiavelli called the imagined truth, elaborate philosophical constructions about ideal governments ruled by perfect princes guided by divine wisdom. Machiavelli announced his intention to pursue something completely different, something he called the effectual truth. He would study how political power actually operates in the real world, regardless of how uncomfortable or morally challenging those observations might prove. This methodological revolution emerged from Machiavelli's professional experience as a senior civil servant in the Florentine Republic. For 14 years, from 1498 to 1512, he served as second chancellor and secretary to the Ten of War. This position required him to conduct diplomatic missions throughout Italy and beyond, negotiate with kings and generals, organize military campaigns, and manage complex domestic political crises. Unlike philosophers who theorized about politics from university libraries, Machiavelli learned about power by wielding it directly. What he observed during those years shattered every comfortable assumption about political leadership that had dominated Western thought since Augustine and Aquinas. The most morally upright rulers frequently lost their kingdoms to more ruthless competitors. Leaders who followed traditional Christian virtues of mercy, forgiveness and trust often presided over disasters that destroyed thousands of lives. Meanwhile, cunning and occasionally brutal rulers secured peace, prosperity and stability for their subjects. The conventional wisdom that linked moral goodness with political effectiveness proved not merely wrong, but dangerously wrong. Good people made terrible rulers when they remained good in traditionally understood ways. Consider the case of Piero Soderini, the head of the Florentine Republic during much of Machiavelli's tenure. Soderini embodied traditional political virtue in every conceivable way. He was honest, merciful, trusting and committed to constitutional procedures and legal precedent. He treated political opponents with fairness and gave them multiple opportunities to prove their loyalty. When faced with dangerous conspiracies, he chose patience and persuasion over decisive action. The result was catastrophic. His enemies exploited his goodness systematically, eventually destroying both him and the republic he had tried so hard to preserve. Soderini's virtue became his fatal weakness, and his people paid the price for his moral consistency. This pattern repeated itself throughout Italian politics during Machiavelli's lifetime. The Italian peninsula had become a battleground where French, Spanish and German armies fought for control, while native rulers proved incapable of effective resistance. Traditional political theory offered no useful guidance for leaders facing such unprecedented challenges. Philosophers could explain why rulers should be just and merciful, but they could not explain how to prevent foreign conquest or domestic revolution. The gap between theoretical wisdom and practical necessity had become so vast that political theory risked becoming completely irrelevant to actual governance. Machiavelli resolved to close that gap by developing an entirely new approach to political analysis. The effectual truth methodology required systematic observation of successful political actors, regardless of their moral status. Machiavelli studied ancient examples like Moses, Cyrus, Romulus and Theseus, alongside contemporary figures like Cesare Borgia and Ferdinand of Aragon. He asked not whether these leaders were good people, but whether they achieved their political objectives effectively. What strategies did they use to acquire power, maintain power and expand power? How did they handle domestic opposition, foreign threats and unexpected crises? What personal qualities enabled them to succeed where others failed? These empirical questions generated insights that would revolutionize political thought and create the intellectual foundation for modern statecraft. But they also generated conclusions that scandalized traditional moralists and made Machiavelli's name synonymous with political evil. The methodological shift from imagined truth to effectual truth created what scholars now recognize as the birth of political science as a distinct discipline. Before Machiavelli, political theory remained a branch of moral philosophy or theology, focused primarily on ethical instruction and spiritual edification. After Machiavelli, serious political analysis required empirical observation, hypothesis testing, and theoretical frameworks that could predict and explain actual political behavior. This transformation made possible everything from modern international relations theory to contemporary studies of electoral behavior and institutional design. But it also created an intellectual crisis that continues to this day. If political effectiveness requires abandoning traditional moral constraints, what happens to the relationship between power and justice? Machiavelli opened this question but never fully resolved it, leaving subsequent generations to struggle with the tension between political realism and moral idealism. Part 2. The psychological architecture of political animals. Machiavelli constructed his entire political philosophy on a foundation of systematic psychological observation that would not be matched in rigor until the emergence of experimental psychology 4 centuries later. His analysis of human nature went far beyond simple cynicism or misanthropy to develop a sophisticated understanding of how cognitive biases, emotional drives and social pressures shape political behavior. This psychological realism became the bedrock of all subsequent Machiavellian analysis, making it essential to understand exactly what he discovered about the human mind and how those discoveries informed his political prescriptions. Modern behavioral economics and political psychology have largely confirmed his core insights about human decision-making under pressure. The centerpiece of Machiavellian psychology is his theory of what we might call conditional loyalty. Humans are not inherently evil or inherently good, but rather inherently self-interested and fundamentally responsive to immediate environmental pressures. People will behave virtuously when virtue serves their interests, and they will behave badly when circumstances make bad behavior advantageous. This means that human behavior is largely predictable if you understand the incentive structures and psychological pressures operating in any given situation. Most importantly, it means that creating good behavior requires designing institutions and policies that make good behavior personally beneficial rather than personally costly. Moral exhortation alone will always fail because it asks people to act against their perceived self-interest. Machiavelli identified several specific cognitive biases that make humans particularly unsuitable for traditional moral polities. First, people consistently prioritize immediate rewards over long-term benefits, even when the long-term benefits are objectively larger and more important. This temporal discounting makes it nearly impossible for leaders to build support for policies that require short-term sacrifice for long-term gain. Citizens will vote against infrastructure spending that would benefit them enormously in 20 years if it requires higher taxes today. They will support military adventures that feel satisfying immediately, even when those adventures create devastating long-term consequences. Political leaders who ignore this bias and appeal to long-term thinking will consistently lose to demagogues who promise immediate gratification. Second, humans demonstrate what Machiavelli called ingratitude, but what modern psychology recognizes as the hedonic treadmill and baseline adjustment. People quickly adapt to improved circumstances and begin taking those improvements for granted. A leader who provides peace and prosperity will find that citizens soon forget the previous chaos and begin complaining about minor inconveniences. Meanwhile, any temporary setback will be blamed entirely on current leadership, regardless of underlying structural causes. This creates a systematic bias against competent but uncharismatic leaders and in favor of dynamic personalities who promise dramatic change. The psychological mechanism that helped humans survive in unstable prehistoric environments becomes a major obstacle to effective governance in complex modern societies. Third, humans exhibit severe overconfidence bias when evaluating their own capabilities and judgment. Most people believe they are above average drivers, above average lovers, and above average judges of character. In political contexts, this translates into citizens who believe they can easily distinguish between honest and dishonest politicians, between realistic and unrealistic policy proposals, between competent and incompetent leadership. This overconfidence makes democratic publics vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation by skilled demagogues who understand how to exploit cognitive weaknesses. It also makes them resistant to expert advice and technical knowledge when that expertise conflicts with their intuitive judgments. Leaders who acknowledge this bias and design their communication strategies accordingly will be more successful than those who assume rational deliberation will prevail. Fourth, Machiavelli observed that humans are fundamentally imitative creatures who take their behavioral cues from social environments rather than abstract principles.
Može, da
People
imamo
want to
dalca.
fit in with their peer groups more than they want to be morally consistent. This means that moral behavior depends heavily on social expectations and visible enforcement mechanisms rather than on internal character development. When corruption becomes normalized in a political system, even initially honest people will begin engaging in corrupt behavior to avoid social isolation. Conversely, when institutional cultures maintain high standards and consistent enforcement, people will behave ethically even when they might prefer to cheat. This insight leads directly to Machiavelli's emphasis on institutional design and legal frameworks rather than moral education as the foundation of good government. Finally, Machiavelli identified what modern psychology calls the fundamental attribution error in political contexts. When bad things happen to them, people blame external circumstances and bad luck. When bad things happen to others, people blame character flaws and poor decision-making. This asymmetry makes it nearly impossible for political leaders to maintain credibility during difficult periods. Citizens will attribute economic downturns, natural disasters, and international crises to leadership failures even when those events result from factors completely beyond governmental control. Meanwhile, they will attribute their personal successes to their own virtues, even when those successes result primarily from favorable social and economic conditions created by effective governance. Understanding this bias helps explain why competent leaders often lose elections during temporary crises, while incompetent leaders sometimes maintain popularity during periods of inherited prosperity. It also explains why successful political leadership requires not just good policy making, but sophisticated management of public psychology and media narratives. Part 3. Virtue versus virtue. The revolutionary redefinition of excellence. No concept in Machiavellian philosophy has generated more confusion and controversy than his radical redefinition of virtue, the Italian word that sounds like virtue but means something fundamentally different and far more complex. Traditional virtue, as understood by Christian moral theology and classical philosophy, involved the consistent practice of moral goodness, regardless of consequences. Machiavellian virtue involves the flexible deployment of whatever qualities and strategies prove necessary for achieving political objectives in specific circumstances. This distinction represents perhaps the most profound break with traditional Western political thought, creating a new framework for evaluating political leadership that prioritizes effectiveness over moral consistency. Classical virtue emphasized 4 cardinal qualities that remained constant across all situations and contexts. Prudence meant making decisions based on moral wisdom and long-term spiritual consequences. Justice meant treating all people according to universal moral principles, regardless of political convenience. Fortitude meant maintaining moral courage even when virtue required personal sacrifice or political disadvantage. Temperance meant moderating all appetites and desires according to rational moral guidelines. These qualities were supposed to create reliable, predictable, and morally admirable behavior that would inspire others to similar virtue. The assumption underlying classical virtue was that moral goodness and political effectiveness would ultimately align because the universe was structured according to divine justice. Good people would eventually succeed and evil people would eventually fail because cosmic order favored righteousness. Machiavellian virtue operates according to completely different principles that reflect empirical observation rather than theological hope. The core principle is situational appropriateness rather than moral consistency. A leader with virtue can be generous when generosity advances political objectives, and ruthless when ruthlessness becomes necessary. They can be honest when honesty builds useful relationships, and deceptive when deception prevents greater harm. They can be patient when patience allows superior positioning, and decisive when delay creates dangerous vulnerabilities. This flexibility requires extraordinary psychological sophistication because it demands constant evaluation of changing circumstances and adaptive responses to new challenges.
Zapali ga,
The
Bog te
psychological
mazo.
requirements for virtue go far beyond simple moral flexibility or ethical relativism. First, leaders must develop what Machiavelli called an accurate understanding of the nature of men. This means seeing people as they actually are, rather than as we wish they were, or as moral theory says they should be. Most political failures result from leaders who project their own values onto other people and assume that others share their motivations
Debilčine
and
idu naprijed
priorities.
nepotrebno.
Effective leaders understand that different people respond to different incentives, and that successful motivation requires matching strategies to specific psychological profiles. This demands sophisticated emotional intelligence and the ability to suppress personal preferences in favor of strategic calculations. Second, virtue requires what we might call temporal flexibility in moral reasoning. Traditional virtue operates according to universal principles that apply equally across all time periods and circumstances. Virtue operates according to contextual analysis that evaluates the specific requirements of particular moments and situations. Sometimes the situation requires immediate decisive action, even when that action violates normal procedural safeguards. Sometimes the situation requires patient long-term planning, even when public pressure demands immediate visible responses. Sometimes the situation requires dramatic public displays of power, even when private negotiation would be more personally comfortable. Leaders with virtue can distinguish between these different situational requirements and adjust their behavior accordingly rather than defaulting to habitual responses. This temporal sensitivity allows them to seize opportunities that less flexible leaders miss and avoid traps that catch more predictable opponents. Third, virtue demands the psychological ability to compartmentalize different moral systems for different spheres of activity. A leader might practice traditional Christian virtue in their personal relationships while employing completely different standards in their political responsibilities. This compartmentalization should not be confused with simple hypocrisy or moral relativism. Instead, it reflects recognition that different social roles involve different moral obligations and that these obligations sometimes conflict with each other. The moral standards appropriate for
Ma ja sam uradio svoje misije,
may be
znači
completely
ostalo me ne
inappropriate
interesuje.
for international diplomacy. The level of trust and forgiveness suitable for personal friendships may be dangerous when applied to political opponents who are actively seeking to destroy you. Leaders with virtue can navigate these different moral systems without becoming paralyzed by cognitive dissonance or abandoning moral reasoning altogether. They maintain moral seriousness while adapting their moral frameworks to fit their functional responsibilities. The most sophisticated aspect of Machiavellian virtue involves what he called knowing the nature of the times. Different historical periods reward different leadership qualities and punish different leadership weaknesses. During periods of stability and prosperity, leaders who emphasize consensus building, institutional respect and gradual reform will be most successful. During periods of crisis and upheaval, leaders who can act decisively, break institutional constraints and impose new orders will be most effective. The tragic irony is that leaders who develop virtue appropriate for one type of period often cannot adapt successfully when historical circumstances change. This explains why many successful wartime leaders fail during peacetime reconstruction, and why many effective peacetime leaders prove inadequate during national emergencies. True virtue would require the almost superhuman ability to reinvent oneself completely as circumstances demand, maintaining psychological coherence while fundamentally altering one's leadership approach. Machiavelli believed that such complete adaptability was theoretically possible but practically very rare, which helps explain why political leadership is so difficult and why truly great leaders appear so infrequently in history. Part 4. Fortune, Contingency and the Limits of Human Control. Machiavelli's analysis of fortune represents one of the most sophisticated treatments of randomness, contingency and uncertainty in the history of political thought. Modern decision theory, game theory, and risk management have largely confirmed his insights about operating effectively under conditions of radical uncertainty. His metaphors for fortune have become embedded in strategic thinking across multiple disciplines, from military planning to business management to personal development. But the deeper philosophical implications of his fortune analysis remain poorly understood and continue to generate interpretive controversies among scholars. The traditional medieval understanding of fortune treated it as either divine providence working through apparently random events, or as a moral testing mechanism that rewarded virtue and punished vice over time. Good people would eventually experience good fortune, and evil people would eventually face destructive consequences. This providential interpretation made fortune essentially predictable in the long run, even if specific timing remained mysterious. It also made fortune morally meaningful, since apparent randomness actually reflected deeper spiritual patterns that human reason could not fully comprehend. Political leaders operating under this framework could assume that virtue would eventually be rewarded, and that temporary setbacks reflected either divine testing or insufficient moral development. This created a relatively stable psychological foundation for political action, since leaders could maintain confidence that moral behavior would ultimately lead to political success. Machiavellian fortune operates according to completely different principles that reflect his commitment to empirical observation rather than theological assumption. Fortune is genuinely random, genuinely powerful, and genuinely indifferent to human moral categories. Good people experience terrible luck, and evil people sometimes prosper through pure chance. This randomness is not a temporary appearance masking deeper providential order, but rather a fundamental feature of political reality that leaders must acknowledge and accommodate. The universe does not care about human political projects and will not adjust natural disasters, economic cycles, or international conflicts to reward virtue or punish vice. This means that political success requires developing strategies that can survive and exploit random events rather than assuming that good intentions will generate favorable circumstances. Machiavelli's famous river metaphor illustrates both the power and the limitations of fortune in political affairs. Fortune resembles a violent river that floods unpredictably, destroying everything in its path and appearing completely unstoppable when it rages. But during calm periods, intelligent people can build dikes, channels, and barriers that will control future floods and direct the river's power toward useful purposes. The metaphor captures several crucial insights about the relationship between human agency and environmental constraints. First, preparation during good times determines survival during bad times. Leaders who assume that current stability will continue indefinitely will be overwhelmed when circumstances change suddenly. Second, you cannot stop or control fortune directly, but you can influence how fortune affects you through advanced planning and institutional design. Third, the same environmental forces that destroy unprepared people can be harnessed to benefit those who understand how to work with natural patterns rather than against them. The gendered dimension of Machiavelli's fortune analysis reflects Renaissance assumptions about psychology and power that modern readers often find troubling. He personified fortune as a woman who responds favorably to bold, aggressive, and even violent approaches from young men. While the specific gender metaphors reflect outdated cultural assumptions, the underlying psychological insight remains valuable for understanding risk-taking and opportunity recognition.
Ostavljamo momci scenat vašim vremenima.
Under uncertainty, rather than those who wait for perfect information before making decisions. It rewards those who are willing to take calculated risks rather than those who prioritize safety and predictability above all other considerations. Most importantly, it advantages those who maintain psychological resilience and adaptive capacity during periods of rapid change rather than those who become paralyzed by complexity and ambiguity. The practical implications of Machiavellian fortune analysis extend far beyond metaphorical speculation to generate specific strategic recommendations that remain relevant across different historical periods and political contexts. First, leaders should diversify their sources of power, legitimacy and support so that random events cannot destroy their entire political foundation simultaneously. Second, they should maintain strategic reserves of resources, energy and political capital that can be deployed rapidly when unexpected opportunities or crises emerge. Third, they should develop multiple contingency plans for different possible futures rather than assuming that current trends will continue indefinitely. Fourth, they should cultivate psychological flexibility and emotional resilience so that they can adapt quickly to changing circumstances without becoming paralyzed by stress or nostalgia for previous conditions. Fifth, they should build institutional systems that can function effectively under different leadership styles and environmental conditions rather than depending entirely on their personal qualities and preferences. Perhaps most importantly, Machiavelli's fortune analysis provides a framework for understanding the relationship between individual agency and structural constraints that avoids both naive optimism and paralyzing pessimism. Leaders cannot control fortune, but they can influence their relationship with fortune through preparation, adaptability, and strategic thinking. This creates space for meaningful human action without generating unrealistic expectations about what political leadership can accomplish. It also helps explain why leadership success depends not just on personal virtues or technical skills, but on the complex interaction between individual qualities and historical circumstances that no one can fully predict or control. Understanding this interaction makes it possible to evaluate political performance more accurately and to develop more realistic expectations about what effective governance can achieve under different conditions. It also provides psychological resources for maintaining hope and agency during difficult periods without falling into the trap of assuming that good intentions alone will generate favorable outcomes. Part 5. The Princely Arts versus Republican Sciences. The relationship between Machiavelli's two major political works, The Prince and the Discourses on Livy, reveals a sophisticated understanding of how different political systems require fundamentally different leadership approaches, institutional designs, and citizen capabilities. Most readers know only The Prince and assume that Machiavelli favored autocratic government over republican alternatives. In reality, his comparative analysis of principalities and republics demonstrates that each system offers distinct advantages and faces unique vulnerabilities depending on historical circumstances and social conditions. The tension between these two works reflects deeper questions about human nature, political development, and the relationship between individual excellence and collective flourishing that continue to shape contemporary political debates. The Prince addresses the specific challenges facing leaders who must create order in chaotic conditions, maintain power in unstable environments, and implement reforms despite organized resistance. These situations require concentrated authority, rapid decision-making, and the ability to use force effectively when persuasion fails. Successful princes must develop personal qualities that enable them to dominate complex political
Ćao, zdravo.
environments through
Znači, ovo
superior
jeste
strategic thinking
debilan,
and
to je govedo.
psychological manipulation. They cannot rely on
Zaletio se
established
on, zaletio se
institutions,
mamački.
legal procedures, or popular consent, because those resources either do not exist or have become corrupted and ineffective. Instead, they must create new institutional arrangements through the force of their individual will and maintain those arrangements through a combination of fear, respect, and carefully managed benefits for key constituencies. This makes princely leadership inherently personal, charismatic, and dependent on exceptional individual capabilities that cannot be easily transferred to successors. The Discourses examines how Republican institutions can harness collective intelligence, distribute power safely among multiple groups, and maintain political vitality over extended time periods. Successful republics develop impersonal procedures that function effectively regardless of individual leadership quality and create systematic incentives for citizens to contribute their talents toward common purposes. They also establish checks and balances that prevent any single person or faction from accumulating enough power to destroy the system from within. This makes Republican government potentially more stable and more capable of complex problem solving than autocratic alternatives. But it also makes republics vulnerable to paralysis during emergencies, corruption during periods of prosperity, and factional conflict when social consensus breaks down. Republican success depends on maintaining sufficient civic virtue among the general population to support institutions that require active citizen participation and voluntary compliance with collective decisions. The key difference between princely and republican approaches involves their respective solutions to what political scientists now call the principal-agent problem. How do you ensure that leaders will pursue public purposes rather than private interests when they possess the power necessary for effective governance? Principalities solve this problem by making the ruler's personal success dependent on the general welfare of their subjects. Princes who destroy their economies, provoke unnecessary wars, or create internal chaos will eventually lose their power to more competent competitors. This creates alignment between individual ambition and collective benefit without requiring moral virtue or altruistic motivation. But it also concentrates enormous risks in individual psychology and provides no systematic mechanism for correcting bad decisions or replacing incompetent leadership. Republics solve the principal-agent problem through institutional competition and distributed accountability. Multiple officials check each other's behavior, and regular elections allow citizens to replace unsatisfactory leaders without violent revolution. This reduces the risks associated with individual incompetence or corruption and creates systematic incentives for responsive governance. But it also makes decisive action more difficult and creates opportunities for special interests to capture governmental processes through superior organization and resources. Republican institutions work well when citizens possess sufficient education, economic security, and civic engagement to monitor their representatives effectively. They fail when social inequality becomes too extreme, when external pressures require rapid responses, or when internal divisions make compromise impossible. Machiavelli's analysis suggests that the choice between princely and republican government should depend on specific historical circumstances rather than abstract philosophical preferences. New nations emerging from colonial rule, societies recovering from civil wars, and communities facing existential external threats may require princely leadership to create basic stability and security. Established societies with educated populations, diversified economies, and stable international environments may benefit more from republican institutions that can process complex information and build broad consensus for difficult policies. The tragedy is that successful princes often resist transitioning to republican institutions, even when changing circumstances make such transitions desirable. Meanwhile, republican governments often prove incapable of producing the decisive leadership necessary during genuine emergencies. This creates a cyclical pattern where political systems alternate between autocratic and republican phases, depending on external pressures and internal development. The deeper philosophical tension between the prince and the discourses reflects competing views about human potential and social development. The prince assumes that most people will remain fundamentally self-interested, short-sighted, and politically passive, regardless of institutional arrangements. This makes exceptional individual leadership necessary for achieving any significant political accomplishments. The discourses suggest that appropriate institutions can cultivate civic virtue and encourage broader participation in political life. This makes collective wisdom and distributed leadership possible under favorable conditions. Modern democratic theory continues to struggle with this same tension between elite leadership and popular participation, between efficiency and representation, between expertise and accountability. Machiavelli's comparative analysis provides a framework for thinking about these trade-offs without assuming that any single institutional design will work optimally under all possible circumstances. The goal is not to choose between princely and republican approaches permanently, but to understand when each approach offers advantages and how societies might transition between different institutional arrangements as their circumstances change. Part 6. War as the ultimate political art. Machiavelli's military philosophy extends far beyond technical discussions of tactics and strategy to encompass a comprehensive theory about the relationship between armed force and political order. He argued that the art of war represents the most fundamental political skill because all
Living my
activities
jabolan.
ultimately depend
Zaleti
on
se
the
preletim
ability to
na ti se.
protect the state from internal and external enemies. This insight generates a systematic analysis of military organization, citizen soldiers versus mercenaries, and the role of violence in creating and maintaining political institutions that has influenced military thinking from Napoleon to modern counterinsurgency doctrine. But his most profound contribution involves demonstrating how military preparation shapes domestic political culture and how different approaches to organizing armed force create different types of political systems. The foundation of Machiavellian military analysis rests on his observation that states cannot survive without effective military institutions, but military institutions pose constant threats to political stability and civilian authority. This creates what we might call the military dilemma of political order. Weak military institutions leave the state vulnerable to foreign conquest and domestic revolution. Strong military institutions create the possibility of military coups and the subordination of civilian government to military priorities. Different solutions to this dilemma generate different types of political systems with different strengths and weaknesses. Understanding these trade-offs becomes essential for designing sustainable political institutions and for evaluating the performance of existing governments. Machiavelli identified three basic approaches to organizing military force, each with distinct political implications and practical consequences. First, rulers can rely on mercenary armies composed of professional soldiers fighting for monetary compensation rather than political loyalty. This approach minimizes the risk of military coups since mercenaries have no direct stake in domestic political arrangements and can be dismissed when their services are no longer needed. But it also creates enormous financial costs, questionable battlefield reliability, and strategic vulnerabilities when mercenary commanders develop their own political ambitions.
Rotary Delta.
Mercenaries fight only as hard as their contracts require and will abandon their employers when offered better terms by opposing forces. They also tend to prolong conflicts unnecessarily to maximize their profits and may switch sides during battles if the military situation appears hopeless. Second, rulers can rely on auxiliary troops provided by allied states or powerful domestic factions. This approach reduces financial costs and can provide access to specialized military capabilities that would be expensive to develop independently. But it also creates dangerous dependencies on external powers who may withdraw their support at crucial moments or use their military assistance to influence domestic political decisions. Auxiliaries ultimately serve their own governments rather than their temporary employers, which means they cannot be trusted completely during conflicts where their home states have independent interests. Domestic auxiliaries provided by powerful families or regional leaders create similar problems since they remain loyal to their original patrons rather than to central governmental authority. Both forms of auxiliary force undermine political independence and create vulnerabilities that sophisticated enemies will eventually exploit. Third, rulers can develop their own native military institutions based on citizen soldiers who fight to defend their homes, families, This approach creates the strongest possible motivation for battlefield effectiveness since soldiers are defending their own vital interests rather than fulfilling contractual obligations or serving foreign masters. Citizen armies also cost less than mercenary alternatives and provide rulers with military force that cannot be easily bribed or corrupted by enemy agents. But citizen soldiers pose greater threats to domestic political stability since they possess both military training and direct stakes in political outcomes. They may use their military capabilities to resist unpopular policies, support political opponents, or demand greater influence over governmental decisions. Managing citizen armies requires different political skills than managing mercenaries or auxiliaries and creates ongoing tensions between military efficiency and civilian control. The relationship between military organization and political culture represents perhaps the most important aspect of Machiavellian military philosophy. Societies that rely primarily on mercenary force tend to develop passive, commercially oriented political cultures where citizens focus on private economic activities and leave political decisions to professional elites. This can generate prosperity and stability during peaceful periods, but creates vulnerabilities during military crises when rapid mobilization becomes necessary. Societies that develop citizen military institutions tend to cultivate more active, participatory political cultures where citizens expect to influence major policy decisions and accept collective defense. This creates greater resilience during military emergencies, but also generates more domestic political conflict and makes efficient decision-making more difficult. The choice between these alternatives reflects deeper questions about the relationship between individual freedom and collective security that continue to shape contemporary debates about military policy and civic obligation. Machiavelli's analysis of fortifications, siege warfare, and defensive strategy illustrates how technological developments interact with political institutions to create new strategic possibilities and vulnerabilities. The development of gunpowder artillery during the late 15th century fundamentally altered the military balance between offensive and defensive capabilities. Traditional high walls and strong castles became liabilities rather than assets when they could be destroyed quickly by cannon fire. This technological shift required new approaches to fortification design, new tactics for siege warfare, and new strategies for territorial defense.
Idemo, jedan je dole, one down.
Static defensive positions. But the political implications extended far beyond purely military considerations. Societies that adapted quickly to new military technologies gained strategic advantages over more conservative competitors. Rulers who understood how technological change affected military effectiveness could exploit temporary advantages to expand their power and influence. Meanwhile, political systems that resisted military innovation often found themselves conquered by more adaptable enemies regardless of their other strengths.
Idemo.
This creates
Sljedeća, ovo je dobivena, gotovo je, znači nije tu šta minuti, nek on to završi, čao zdravo.
And willingness to modify existing institutions when technological or strategic circumstances change. Modern examples include the impact of nuclear weapons on international relations, the role of cyber warfare in contemporary conflicts, and the implications of artificial intelligence for future military competition. Part 7. Religion as Statecraft, the Political Utility of Sacred Power. Machiavelli's treatment of religion represents one of the most sophisticated and controversial aspects of his political philosophy, revealing deep insights about the relationship between spiritual belief and political order that anticipate modern theories of civil religion, ideological hegemony and cultural legitimacy.
Ti baš znaš da potrefiš, Bog te mazo. Tako je, znači, dođem ovu još jednu partiju, odigram ja odo. Ali nema veze, šta, desilo se tako, dođe za 2 sata, tako da, Jesi uzeo pločice? Svaka čast, tako i treba. Nemoj ti vamo.
Practical insights about how religious institutions interact with political
power
remain remarkably prescient and continue to influence contemporary analysis of political legitimacy and social cohesion. The foundation of Machiavellian religious analysis rests on his observation that all successful political systems require some form of shared belief system that motivates citizens to sacrifice individual interests for collective purposes. Purely rational political calculation cannot generate sufficient motivation for the kinds of personal sacrifices that effective governance sometimes requires. Citizens must believe that their political community serves purposes larger and more important than immediate material benefits if they are going to support unpopular but necessary policies, pay taxes that exceed their direct governmental benefits, or risk their lives in military service. Religion provides the most powerful source of such transcendent motivation because it connects political obligations to ultimate spiritual meanings that rational argument alone cannot establish. This makes religious institutions potentially valuable political assets, but it also makes them potentially dangerous political rivals, depending on how religious and political authorities manage their relationship.
Sad je to gotovo, dečak.
The key question becomes how to harness religious motivation for political purposes without allowing religious institutions to dominate or undermine governmental authority.
Nevkarac izrevaldiva švedski osnovniče ideje tokom brzeg perioda, en shvatil sam svoju toplovu I organizovao.
can
Pružanje
integrate
Ljebe,
srpskih
dragi,
uslova 120
čuti ba, znači,
sources of legitimacy
1620 me čovjek zgazio,
Roman
heavy,
religious practices were designed primarily to serve civic purposes,
1620 me
rather than
zgazio,
to provide individual spiritual
1620 stramming damage od ozgo, pao sabrda na mene.
Religious ceremonies reinforced
Jebem
social
ti
hierarchies,
zunce.
celebrated political achievements and created collective experiences.
Zaletio se i kod
that
mene, nisam mogu da se,
strengthened group identity
nisam
and
mogu da se
solidarity.
izokrenem dovoljno brzo da pobjegnem.
Religious institutions supported governmental authority by teaching
Ljebe,
citizens that
dragi.
their political obligations reflected divine will and that political success
Računal
indicated
pročet.
divine favor. But Roman religion
Ne
also
vjerujete mnogo
provided resources
pročet.
for political criticism and reform when existing institutions became corrupt
Znači,
or
Bož.
ineffective. Religious traditions could be invoked to justify opposition to tyrannical rulers or to support necessary changes in governmental policies and procedures.
Znači ti igraš sa
This
Maxom,
created
Max
a
Gaming
dynamic balance
FPS.
where religion supported political stability without preventing political adaptation and
Evo to ovdje
innovation.
na njegovom streamu.
Religious and
Himmelsdorf.
political institutions reinforced each other while maintaining sufficient independence
Ja ništa i ne
to
volim.
avoid complete
Ma zajebava.
subordination of
Te
either
nakon ne
sphere to the other. The contrast between ancient Roman religion and contemporary Christianity reveals how different
Kad
religious
počinje danas
systems
ovaj
create
Twitch?
different political possibilities and constraints. Christianity emphasizes individual spiritual salvation, universal moral principles, and transcendent values that often conflict with practical political necessities.
Šta me kad...
Christian moral teaching encourages
Yeah.
forgiveness rather than punishment, humility rather than pride, otherworldly
Kad počinje
purpose
Twitch danas?
rather than political engagement.
Po ne znam to.
These spiritual
Ako opet.
emphases can undermine
Bratom,
the
već sam pet.
psychological qualities
U pet.
necessary for effective
U pet.
political leadership and military service. Christian institutions also claim independent authority
Pa dobro
to
je to u
evaluate
pet.
political decisions according to religious criteria.
Mislim, i uvijek u pet ide kako se zove, ovako pitaš kad kreće dropovile, ili kreće radini, eto on
They can
zračne
paralyze
stvari.
governmental decision-making or generate civil wars between competing sources of ultimate authority.
Bam, 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 bam,
But
bam, bam.
Christianity also provides powerful resources for political legitimacy and social cohesion when religious and political authorities coordinate their activities effectively.
Empire's Border, niko nije na
Christian
sredinu
moral
otišao.
teaching
Pametne,
can
majmunčine,
motivate
debilne.
extraordinary personal sacrifices for collective purposes and create
Znači, izgubljena
strong
partija,
social
džaba,
bonds that
džaba,
transcend
džaba
economic
uzaludnog
and ethnic
počinjanja.
divisions. Machiavelli's practical recommendations for managing religious institutions focus